Hi everyone. So sorry if the audio and video and everything else on this is a little tough to understand. Apologies for cancellation of lecture as well. Sort of out of my hands again, but we're going to do our best here. I'm going to try to teach you about labor markets remotely, so please bear with the social discord on our campus for the moment, and we will try to learn something here about labor markets. This is actually a pretty important piece of economics since minimum wages, labor markets, labor disputes, this kind of topic is in the news all the time. So one of the most recent policy changes has been California's decision, our state's decision, to raise its minimum wage. So this is a few years ago. The state decided to raise its minimum wage from $10 to $15 over the course of several years. Uh, so this is one of the biggest proportional minimum wage increases in history. So economists have no idea really what's going to happen because we really haven't seen minimum wage increases this big. We have some reasons. I will show you the sort of basic neoclassical model of the labor market to explain why some economists are a little worried about this. But um, even before we talk about economists, we can talk about how politicians are responding to this. In particular, politicians from outside of California. So here was an article about Florida's Governor Rick Scott. So after California announced it was going to make this increase, Rick Scott released an ad campaign to try to convince businesses in California that it was time to pick up and move to Florida in order to run their businesses because maybe it's just unaffordable for people to live and work and run their businesses in California. Now pick up and come over here. And so at their much lower minimum wage of $8.05 an hour. So let's join the dark side for a moment and suppose that you are a spokesperson for Enterprise Florida. This is the organization or the organization that Rick Scott and his friends set up to convince Californian businesses and Californian workers to come to Florida. So you've been called in before a group of California labor leaders to explain this claim. In your employer's ad that California's minimum wage hike is hurting the same people it was supposed to help. So how can you actually explain this based on basic economic theory? Is it possible to say maybe a minimum wage hike would hurt the same people it was supposed to help? So to figure this out, we have to talk about unemployment. All right. So we'll talk about the basic model, supply and demand for labor, and we'll talk about the effect of a minimum wage, what is unemployment, what are the different forms of unemployment, and what affects the level of each. All right, so first we're going to start out talking about the market for labor. It turns out the market for labor looks very much like the market for everything else, or every other market we've seen so far. So we have 10 potential workers, Carlos, Alan, Grace, Esther, and Milton, our old friends. Now they are no longer looking for surfboards. They are no longer looking to save their money, but they are looking for jobs. So each of them has an opportunity cost for work. This is describing the value of, say, an hour of their time. Now, Carlos, as always, is just up for anything. He doesn't really have a whole lot to do today, maybe. The surf isn't very good, so he doesn't feel like going surfing. Kids are at school, so he doesn't need to be watching them. And, there's a strike, so he doesn't have to come to campus and teach a lecture. So he's willing to work for $10. So you want to paint a fence, you want to, build a shed, whatever he's willing to offer an hour of his time for a price of $10. Alan is, as always, a little bit more reluctant than Carlos. He has some other stuff. He could be practicing playing drums. He's got, this massive bamboo tree in his backyard that he needs to cut down, and so he's got some other stuff he needs to do. But he's also, he could be convinced to work for you for $20. Grace, her time is even more valuable. She needs to be paid $30 to work for an hour. Esther, 40, Milton, $50. All right. So this, so again, we are used to thinking of individuals, our friends, Carlos, Alan, Grace, Esther, and Milton, as the consumers. But in the market for labor, this is crucial. In the market for labor, individuals are the supply side. It's kind of like the market for loanable funds, right? Where individuals are the supply of loanable funds because they're saving money. Same deal here. Individuals in this market are the supply of labor because these are the people who might want to work. Just think about it in your case, right? You're not typically going to hire people, you are going to be hired. And so you are supplying labor to firms. So we can take this and plot it, and it looks like any supply curve, right? It's just upward sloping. Um, this is what we would expect of any supply curve. So quiz, obviously you don't have top hat, so you can't take this in the regular sense, but pause for a moment, maybe even pause the video and think about the answer here. So suppose I need 2 workers to paint my fence. What is the lowest wage I must pay? And as always, I have to offer a single wage to everyone, right? So I'm going out in the middle of these 5 folks and announcing, the wage is this. Um, will you be willing to paint my fence for that? What must the wage I offer be? What's the lowest wage I can offer? And get 2 workers to paint my fence. All right, so maybe pause the video for a second and think about that. All right, hope you paused the video and thought about that. So if we look at this, so if I offer a wage of $10, I will get Carlos, but that's only one person. If I offer a wage of $30, I will get Carlos, Alan, and Grace, but that's more people than I need, right? So it's really the lowest wage I can offer is $20, then I will get Carlos and Alan, and I will have 2 workers, right? So basic, probably what you're kind of used to from dealing with all the other markets you can think of, right? Let's pretend we're saying surfboards instead of labor, and yeah, all of that intuition you had from earlier in the course still applies. All right, and as always, we can think instead of having 5 workers, we have 5 billion workers, 5 trillion workers, whatever, and so we can smooth this out and get a nice smooth supply curve for labor. All right, so as I said, supply of labor is people seeking to sell their time. Those with a higher opportunity cost have to be paid a higher wage, and that's why it's an upward sloping curve. Looks like just any other supply curve. The only difference is the interpretation. Who is behind that supply curve? Who is the supplier? All right. Now, the demand for labor is a little bit more, in some ways, a little more complicated, but it's actually not so hard because we've done all of this hard work before the midterm thinking about the demand for capital. The demand for labor is actually somewhat similar. So think back to our production function, right? So mostly we've been focusing on this part of the production function, the K, but we also have this thing in here. This is, you can think about this as education times labor. This is sort of human capital. So the human element are workers. And just like with capital, there is a marginal product of labor, and we think about it as being diminishing, right? So holding everything else fixed, if I have a certain number of machines, say I have 5 machines in my factory, or I have 5 checkout counters in my supermarkets, it's great to have 5 workers for that. 10 workers might, increase my output a little bit. Maybe I'll have one person checking out groceries, another person bagging them. But when I get to 15 workers, it's not clear why I need 3 workers for every checkout counter. They might be able to add a little bit, but not as much as that second worker did. When I get to 100 workers for 5 checkout counters, we're past the point of absurdity. It's not clear how much more I'm getting out of that. So the additional benefit of each extra worker is a little bit lower. So we have this diminishing marginal product, and this implies a diminishing marginal product of labor, right? And so this thing is crucial. The marginal product of labor is how much benefit the firm gets from hiring an extra worker. And so as always, it's going to think about comparing the benefit of hiring an extra worker to the cost. And what's the cost? It's the wage, right? If I want to hire a worker for 1 hour, well, how much must I pay them? That's the wage. And so if I'm out here, this is how many workers I have. The benefit of hiring an extra worker is the marginal product. The cost is the wage. And so there is a gap between these, which implies that I can make my firm better off. I can increase my output by hiring more workers. And so I'm going to want to increase my labor supply, right? On the other hand, if I'm out here, I've got a ton of workers, then the marginal product of that last worker I hired is lower than the cost of hiring them. So I'm going to want to reduce my labor supply, um, moving in sort of this direction. I'm going to want to, you know, fire some workers or let them go. And so that's going to push me to this point here, as always, where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. And so I will want to set my marginal product of labor equal to the wage, right? So this is sort of the key condition here. And so, and of course, if the wage increases, then I'm going to want to hire fewer workers because of that diminishing marginal product, right? So each extra worker is more expensive. That means I'm going to hire fewer because really it's no longer worth it for me to have this many workers, all right? So what this implies is I can think about now sort of flipping this. So taking this logic, what we learned here is as the wage increases, my firm's individual demand for labor is decreasing. And so now, so I've changed the axes here. Now I have wage on the vertical axis and labor demand on the horizontal axis. And we just proved to ourselves through this logic that as the wage increases, my demand for labor decreases. All right. And so as usual, we can take this might be for an individual firm, we can take this, add it up, and get total demand for labor in the markets. And we've just proven to ourselves it has to be downward sloping, right? So this is the demand for labor, right? So the demand for labor is firms hiring workers, or rather hiring their time. So a firm's demand for 1 extra hour of labor. So a higher marginal product of labor implies a higher demand, right? And so, and as we said, the marginal product of labor is just the extra output I get from hiring 1 more worker or 1 more hour of work or 1 more day of work or whatever. The marginal product of labor, just like the marginal product of capital, is diminishing. The more workers I have, the less I benefit from hiring 1 more worker. So the firms will hire until the marginal product of labor equals the wage. And because the marginal product of labor is diminishing, total labor demand is decreasing in the wage, right? So in other words, if there's a higher wage, I'm going to want to hire fewer workers. And so this gives us the labor market, right? So we have a supply and we have a demand, and now it just looks exactly like every other market we've seen, right? And all of our usual tricks, all of our usual algebra works out fine. The one difference to keep in mind here is that the supply side is the workers and the demand side is the firms, right? So in that regard, it's a little different from, say, the market for surfboards. We're used to thinking of individuals, people, as the demand side, but in the market for labor, it's the other way around, right? The firms are buying our time, all right? And so once you remember that, everything else works out exactly as you'd expect, right? So the quantity here is total number of workers hired, and the wage here is, or rather the price in this market is the wage, and so where these cross is the equilibrium wage. That's the wage that will prevail in the labor market. So quick example here, so suppose that the supply of surfboard engineers in Santa Cruz is described by this equation here, so it's increasing, right? So higher wage means more people want to work as surfboard engineers. Meanwhile, surfboard manufacturers have this demand curve, so it is downward sloping as always, right? So it's decreasing. The higher the wage, the lower the demand. And so now we can ask ourselves, in equilibrium, how many engineers are hired and what is the hourly rate? So think about this for a moment, pause the video perhaps, and try to do this out for yourself, solve it for yourself. What is the wage and how many workers are hired? All right, so hope you actually did that. And so the way we do this is the same as always, right? So we want to find an equilibrium. Let's just set supply equal to demand, our usual equilibrium condition. So find me the wage that makes the number of engineers who want to work equal to the number of engineers that our surfboard firms want to hire. All right, so we do this, and then we get some algebra, right? And then we just do our usual thing. We move 3W over to this side of the equation. 5W equals 50, divide both sides by 5, we get equilibrium wage of $10 per hour. Um, and then we just take this and plug it into, say, the supply curve. We could have also plugged it into the demand curve, and we get the 20 surfboard engineers are hired. All right. Very simple, straightforward, like every other market you've dealt with. All right. So here's the thing. This lecture was supposed to be about unemployment, right? And I have not yet used the word unemployment. So what's going on here? So far we have been talking about the equilibrium in the market for labor, and it's worth noting that so we will see in equilibrium there is no unemployment. Why is that? Well, it comes down to the way we define unemployment. So what does it mean to be unemployed? So let's start out by summarizing a bunch of definitions here. All right, so we have the US population. So this is everyone in the country. And so we're all here. We're all happy to be here, I hope. And so now among this subset of the US population, well, some of them are not adults, right? Children. We don't let children work, at least not in the market for paid labor in this country. So we want to leave those people aside. Some people are in the military, so obviously they already sort of have a job. Um, they have to show up to work, and so we don't really think about them as being employed or unemployed. And then there are people who are institutionalized in quotation marks. That means people who might be in hospitals, people who might be in prison, people who might be in mental health facilities, that kind of thing, right? So people who are basically prevented from working by their situation, by literally not being able to leave a certain area, right? So they cannot show up to work. So let's leave those people aside, and we have what's called the non-institutionalized adult civilian population, right? That's literally just the set of the sub-US population that is not falling under one of these categories here. All right, so among these, now we can further divide this. There's a set of people. So this group are people who are capable of working, but not all of them want to work, right? So some people might be, students, and this describes many of you. You might be here you might just focus full time on getting an education and not be working. So you don't actually want a job. There might be people who are homemakers, so people who stay at home and take care of children, for example. Those folks also don't necessarily want a job. There might be people who are retired, right? So my parents are retired. They are not looking for work. They don't want a job. You could offer them a job. They probably wouldn't take it. And so those folks are not in the labor market. They just do not want to work at the prevailing wage. Now, it's possible if you were to offer them a high enough wage, you offer someone $500,000 an hour. It doesn't matter how much they want to focus on school, they will probably drop out of school and take that job. So the definition of the labor force is going to depend a little bit on the wage, but conditional on some prevailing wage, some prevailing labor market condition. You have a set of people who are not willing to work, and then a set of people who are willing to work. That is the labor force. And a big chunk of those will probably manage to find a job. They are called employed. Now, what remains are the people who want to work at the prevailing wage in the prevailing labor market conditions, cannot find a job. That is the unemployed population. And so we have this one person left over. This person is not happy. They are sad because they want a job and they cannot find one. All right. So in practice, can we see this? So let me actually just show you this in practice so this is the economic news release. This is the employment situation summary table from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So every month they will release this document. And just to tell you about, so I actually have friends from grad school who work at the BLS, and they've told me about this process. It's pretty remarkable. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when it is about to release a jobs report, what it does is it actually goes into lockdown, meaning if you are an employee so basically, I forget whether it's like 8 hours or 24 hours or whatever, before the actual release of this document to the public, the BLS goes into lockdown, meaning anybody who is working on this report is not allowed to leave the BLS. They are not allowed to communicate with everyone. They basically have to stay in the office and like I think they actually may have to even sleep in the office or something. But basically, they're incommunicado with the rest of the world because this document will move stock markets. So we talked about having inside information. The BLS wants to make sure nobody gets wind of this until it is released to everybody at the same time. All right, so they take this really, really seriously. So what do we learn from this? So if you look here, you can see here what is the civilian non-institutional population. So it is 254 million people, so this is in thousands. Um, so they take out the institutionalized people, you have the civilian labor force. Among those, you have the people who are employed, um, and then the people who are unemployed. You notice that, so these two things add up to the civilian labor force, right? And so we have here, as of April 2017, there were 7 million people who were unemployed. Now, April 2018, the most recent jobs number was about 6 million people. And so you see the unemployment rate is 3.9%. Where does this number come from? So if we pull up a calculator, basically what they're doing is taking this number, unemployed, and dividing it by the civilian labor force, or rather, yes, the civilian labor force here. And there you go, right? 3.9%. All right, so that's where that number is coming from. So there are some other stuff over here. We'll talk about this in a moment, right? But this is basically the idea behind the unemployment rate and all those definitions. So to make this a little bit more formal, so first we can think about the labor force participation rate. So you saw this over here, right here, right? The participation rate. The way this is defined is it's just the employed plus the unemployed. This is also the labor force, right? So you remember from our definition over here, the labor force is the employed and the unemployed. So you take the sum of those, that is the labor force. You divide that by the non-institutionalized adults, multiply by 100%. Basically, the intuition behind this is these are all the people who, so the denominator is all the adults capable of working, and the numerator is all of the subset of that who want to work, right? So that gives us the labor force participation rate. So we can see from our document over here, the participation rate is 62.8%, so about 63%. That means about 37% of the people in the US who are able to work, 100% minus 63, that is the fraction of people who just are capable of working, but for whatever reason do not want to work. They're retired, they're students, they're homemakers or whatever, all right? Now, then we can think about the unemployed. So the unemployment rate, as I said, it's the number of unemployed divided by the labor force. So the labor force, again, is employed plus unemployed times 100%. How do they define this in practice? Right, so the way they do this is with something called the current population survey. So this is a survey done by, I believe it is done by the BLS. So every month they will run this survey. They will find a sample of households, some hundreds of thousands of households around the country, and they will ask them a series of questions. First, they ask them, are you an adult? All right, so we want to figure out if you're an adult, and are you in the military, et cetera, right? So make sure you are a member of the adult non-institutionalized population. Then they ask you, do you have a job? And if not, are you looking for work? And are you unable to find work, right? So let me show you here. So this is my desk camera. And so I can actually show you the current population survey questionnaire. So this is the actual questionnaire that they use. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about work-related activities. So think about the week beginning on Sunday, blah, blah, blah. And so here is one, so this survey has many, many questions. So I'm focusing on the ones that are relevant to this. So for here, week before last, did you do any work for pay? So if you answer yes, then you are employed, right? So you fall into that pool of employed people. Um, if you answer retired, disabled, or unable to work, one of these three, then you are considered you're considered non-employed, meaning that you are not in the labor force. If you answer no, then we have to ask you some more questions. Have you been working? Have you been looking for work, basically? Right, so this is the crucial question here. So if you answer no to this, so you say, I did not work, but I'm also not looking for work, then you would be considered, again, not in the labor force. The BLS will assume you just don't want a job. Um, on the other hand, if you say you are not employed, we've established you are a member of the adult non-institutionalized population, so are not disabled, not unable to work. You don't have a job, but you have been looking for work. You have been looking for full-time work. Then you are unemployed, right? So you want a job, you've been looking for a job, don't have one right now, then you are unemployed. All right, so those are the series of questions we use to determine what's called U3 or the unemployed. So that is the pool of people who fall into this pool here, right? So based on that, that is where the 6.3 million people who are unemployed in April of 2018, that's where that number comes from. All right, very good. So here's a question. So going back to our model of the labor market, so this subset of people here, right? This is the set of people who do not have a job in our labor market model. Now, think to yourself, are these people unemployed? Are they outside of the labor force? So in the model, the answer is no, right? Because these are people whose um, willingness to accept the opportunity cost of working is higher than the prevailing wage. In other words, the benefit of not working is higher than the benefit of working. And so they would choose, they would look at that and say, okay, I could have a job at this prevailing wage, but it's just not worth it for me to work at that wage. And so they choose not to work. So in that case, they're just not in the labor force, right? So these are people who'd say maybe, the benefit of studying at the University of California full time is higher than the prevailing wage, and so I choose not to work at this wage, and so they're outside the labor force. But now think instead about someone who has maybe lost their previous job, say that they used to work at a factory for $30 an hour, then the factory closes, and now they know that the Starbucks down the street is hiring for $10 an hour, but they choose not to take that job. Um, they might say, I'm looking for work, but I can't find it. But are they unemployed if they have the option of working? It's hard to say, right? This is almost a philosophical question. So I'll describe a little bit. So they would probably say, I've been looking for work, but can't find it. And so they would probably pop into the unemployed pool. And it's possible that's right. It's possible we should be thinking about them in that way. But there is a certain ambiguity here when we try to map the model to reality. All right. So I just want you to sort of think about that. But at least as far as the model is concerned, these folks here are not unemployed. They are simply outside the labor force. In fact, in our model, as we will see in a moment, you actually do not have any unemployment unless there is a price distortion. All right. Um, but leaving this question aside, there's also some other challenges to measuring the unemployment rate, ones that are in some ways more serious. So the first issue is what are called discouraged workers. So these are people who want a job at the prevailing wage, but they've stopped looking for work because they have simply given up, right? So they've just given up. They've been looking for work for a month, for 2 months, for a year, and they just decided, all right, I just can't find a job. There is no employer in the world that wants to hire me right now. And so they just give up. And the problem here is if you ask them, have you been looking for work? So the CPS interviewer shows up at their house and asks, have you been looking for work? They would say no. And so then we might conclude that they are not in the labor force, right? They're not looking for work, they don't want a job. But the thing is, they actually do want a job. It's just that they're not looking because they've given up on it, right? And so they would be counted incorrectly as not in the labor force when maybe we have to be thinking about them as unemployed. Another issue is there might be part-time workers. So people who are working, say, for $20 an 20 hours a week, and so you ask them, "Do you have a job?" And they'd say, "Yes, I have a job." But the problem is they don't want to be working 20 hours a week. They want to be working 40 hours a week, right? And so although they have a job, they don't have as much job. They have employment, but they are not fully employed, and so they would like a full-time job. And so maybe we ought to be counting them as sort of not employed as well. Um, so the way we deal with this, the way the BLS deals with this, it's called the underemployment rate. So it basically adjusts the standard unemployment rate to take into account that we should have these people. So the underemployment rate is defined as the unemployed, as we measured them before, plus the number of discouraged workers, that's this group of people, plus the involuntary part-time workers, which is this group of people. And then we divide by the labor force plus the discouraged workers. So the labor force already includes the part-time workers, right? Because they've already said they're working, so they're already in here. But we have to adjust for the discouraged people who we had previously thought are not in the labor force. Turns out they actually want a job, and so we want to now account for them, right? So this is a more complete picture of the full labor force, and this is a more complete picture of the full underemployed population, all right? And going back to our BLS questionnaire, so down here we have a question. Uh, so, you know, suppose we ask someone, have you been looking for work? And they say no, then we could just directly ask them, do you want a job, either full or part-time? And if they say yes to this, then they are considered a discouraged worker. If they say no, then they really are not in the labor force, right? And then they have this in case, someone screwed up the earlier questions, and in fact, they do have a job. Now, this question here is for, or these two questions are for figuring out if someone is involuntary part-time. So we can ask them, do you usually work 34 hours or more per week? And if they say yes, then okay, they're fully employed. But if they say no, or if they say their hours vary, then we can ask them further, do you actually want to work a full work week of 35 hours a week? And if they say, no, I don't work full hours or my hours vary, and then they say yes to wanting this, then we can think of them as involuntary part-time workers. They don't work a full work week, but they want to work a full work week. And then if they say no here, then we can say, okay, they have a part-time job, but it's not involuntary. They're doing what they want, and so we don't have to consider them underemployed. All right, so that is how we define the underemployment rate. And you can see in the usual, again, if we go back to the BLS report here, you can see down here that we have people employed at part-time. So we can see here the number of discouraged workers. The marginally attached workers is a more broad category describing this. And then we can also see the people who are working part-time for economic reasons, right? So I could only find part-time work. So this is how the BLS tries to adjust these numbers. So when people say the unemployment rate isn't an accurate measure of the people who are like, the pain in the labor market, that's sort of what they might be trying to get at. All right. So quick review, labor force is defined as the employed plus the unemployed. Labor force participation rate, fraction of the people capable of working who want to work. That's employed plus unemployed divided by non-institutionalized adults. In other words, the labor force divided by non-institutionalized adults. Unemployed, as per the standard definition, it is the people who want to work but cannot find work, or rather the people who are looking for work, cannot find work, divided by the labor force times 100%. Now, we've talked about a couple of challenges of measurement. So It's hard to know whether someone is willing to work at the current wage and can't find a job versus willing to work if they were offered a higher wage but can't find a job. The other challenge is what we described earlier, the discouraged workers and the part-time workers who are involuntarily part-time. And so we adjust for that using the underemployment rate. All right, so far we've been thinking about unemployment as this broad, uniform thing, but it's actually worth splitting up unemployment based on why people are actually unemployed. There are three types we think about, so frictional, structural, and cyclical, and the welfare consequences of these three different types of unemployment are quite different. So frictional unemployment arises when somebody loses their job and they are in the process of finding a new job. So let's suppose we have someone, they are working at Radio Shack, you can say for $18 an hour, um, and now you might know Radio Shack is basically shut down. All of their stores, or most of their stores, have closed, and so you no longer have a job. So our friend here, you can see they still have a smile on their face. They are still optimistic. I don't have a job now, but I'm going to keep looking. And so they go to Safeway and check, are you hiring? And Safeway says, yes, we're hiring at $10 an hour. And they say, well, I mean, I would have a job if I took this, but I was paid $18 an hour before. And Safeway isn't necessarily a good fit for me. I was working for Radio Shack. I was working for a store that sold electronics. I know a lot about electronics. And so the reason why Safeway isn't offering to pay me very much is because they need someone who knows a lot about groceries. And, this isn't a good fit for me. So next, they try Staples. And they go to Staples and say, well, this is, Staples says, you're a slightly better fit for us. We sell some electronics, but we also sell a lot of paper, a lot of also like office equipment like printers, and Radio Shack didn't sell that kind of thing. It was focusing mostly on consumer goods. We could offer you $15 an hour. And this person says, well, $15 is better than $10, but it's still less than what I got before, still less than what I think I could get if I found a better matching employer. And so they continue to look, right? Finally, they try Best Buy, and it turns out Best Buy is hiring, and they offer $20 an hour, right? This is a really good match because Best Buy is in very much the same area of work as Radio Shack. It's selling consumer goods or other consumer electronics. And so this they accept, right? And so while they were doing this, while they were checking at Safeway, while they were checking at Staples, that might have taken some days, some weeks. And during that time, they were unemployed, right? They were searching for work, unable to find it. And so the BLS would have marked them as unemployed. But it was not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's actually a good thing that they are unemployed during that period because we would not have wanted them to take the job at Safeway, right? Because that's not a good match for their skills. We wanted them to spend that time looking for the best possible match. And so this type of frictional unemployment isn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as the person, making the search can actually ultimately find a job and, is able to pay the bills during that period. And this type of unemployment is very common in the US economy. So this figure here is a little complicated. So it has two vertical axes. So the dark line here is what's called the job finding probability. This is the probability that someone who is unemployed finds a job within the next month. And so you want to look at this axis over here. And here in the US, it is quite high. So if you are unemployed, every month that you are unemployed, you typically have somewhere around a 50% chance. So about half of the people who are unemployed in any given month will find a job by the end of the month. And this is quite high. The dashed line over here is the separation probability. This is the probability somebody who has a job will lose their job in any given month. And usually it hovers around somewhere between 3 and 4%, right? And so it's a lot smaller, but bear in mind, there are a lot more people who are employed. Now, what is remarkable about this, so if you were to look at Europe, for example, you would find both of these numbers to be a lot lower. So the probability someone loses their job in Europe is a lot lower, but also the probability someone who does not have a job, who has lost their job, the probability they find a new job is a lot lower. And this is because the US labor market is relatively dynamic. So we have a lot of jobs destroyed every month and a lot of new jobs created. And so economists generally consider this a great strength of the US labor market, the fact that, yeah, we have a lot of people losing their job every month, but then they're finding new jobs. We consider this an efficient reallocation of labor from firms that aren't using people very effectively, right? So workers are a valuable resource. We want them to be allocated to the firms that need them the most. And this kind of churn in the labor market, the destruction of firms that really just aren't profitable, and the expansion of firms that are profitable, that's a good thing. We talked about that when we talked about financial markets. This is the flip side of it, what they are hiring. All right, so frictional unemployment, it's just people in between jobs. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what we call creative destruction. So this type of unemployment is not necessarily a problem. Now, structural unemployment, on the other hand, is a bigger issue. So this can be caused by either shifts in the structure of the economy, literally the types of skills that we as a society need changes for some reason, either because a new technology is invented or because um, a shift in our trading partners, for example. Another possibility is that there are policies or institutions we have in place that create unemployment in some way. So the first example, think about back in the 1800s when the Industrial Revolution was just starting. So at the time, just before the Industrial Revolution, hand weavers were a uh, major group of workers. So these are people who are by hand weaving cloth, or rather weaving thread into cloth or whatever, weaving cotton into cloth. Um, and so we had some labor market. Then along comes the Industrial Revolution, which gives us the power loom. So in 1785, the power loom is invented. This is a machine that allows a single person to weave the same amount of cloth as, a dozen hand weavers. So this is going to reduce the demand for actual hand weavers, skilled hand weavers, because we don't need them anymore. We can get a less skilled person with a power loom to do the same work as many of these people. So that's going to reduce the demand for their labor. It's going to reduce their wage. And so many of these people might now be looking for work, looking for new jobs, and not able to find work at the old wage that they had. It's certainly going to reduce the wage for them. And so during the Industrial Revolution, this was actually a big issue. So the original Luddites were people who followed this guy named Ludd. He was leading these former hand weavers to basically destroy power looms because they were the source of their issues, of their labor market issues, right? So we often forget that the original Industrial Revolution, it created all these benefits, but during the time when it was happening, it created a lot of hardship. So I met someone in the history department who studies this, and he says that, yeah, the Industrial Revolution had big benefits, but during that time, the workers who were affected were like really badly affected. And we're seeing something similar in the labor market right now, right? We have these new machine learning algorithms that are able to do the work that was formerly done by accountants, by paralegals, etc. And certainly, of course, people in manufacturing. They've been automated out of jobs. It's the same issue. Those folks are in a desperate situation because the structure of the labor market has changed so that their skills are no longer as valuable as they used to be. All right, so that is sort of shifts in the structure of the economy, sort of outside of our hands, but we could also have labor market uh, unemployment created by policies of the government. So a few of these, minimum or union wages, unemployment benefits, and hiring and firing costs. All right, so in our market or rather in our standard model of the labor market, a minimum wage works like a price floor, right? So basically, the government comes in and says, you shall not pay workers less than some amount for an hour of their work. That is, at least in this model, analogous to the government coming in and saying, you shall not pay less than $150 for a surfboard, right? And so this minimum wage has the same effect as any price floor. So in this situation, the supply of labor, the number of people who want to work at this relatively high wage, exceeds the number of firms that want to hire. And so there is a gap and excess supply of labor. But in the context of the labor market, we call that unemployment, right? These are people who want to work at the prevailing wage, but cannot find a job because only this many employers want to hire. All right. And the same idea applies to a union wage. So a union negotiates a wage that is higher than the equilibrium price. That could potentially have the same effect. Um, Disclaimer here, the fact that I am mentioning unions here has absolutely nothing to do with the union workers on strike today. This lecture was planned years in advance. So, um, uh, yes, nothing politically motivated in this lecture at all. It's just uh, standard fare um, that happens to coincidentally be on the day of the labor strike. So going back to our original example, so remember, you've joined the dark side, you are working for Rick Scott, trying to convince Californian employers, Californian workers to move to Florida, that this minimum wage is not in their interest. So let's suppose that you are meeting with representatives of the Federation of Santa Cruz Surfboard Engineers. So you figured out based on the shops, the engineers, you know the labor demand and the labor supply curve. So what would unemployment be under this new minimum wage? So we have the same supply curve, the same demand curve we had before. Now the government is imposing a minimum wage of $15. How many engineers are unemployed? All right. So sit down for a moment, plan this out, do it for yourself, then come back and show you the answer. All right. So what is the answer? We just do this the same way as usual, right? So we just take our minimum wage of $15, sub it into the labor supply curve, and we find that at $15, 30 people want to work as surfboard engineers. We take the same wage, $15, sub it into the demand curve, and we get that only five firms want to hire only 5 engineers. And so the difference between the number of people who want to work at $15 and the number of people who will get hired actually is unemployment, right? So we have 25 surfboard engineers willing to work at the prevailing wage of $15, but unable to find jobs. And so 25 of them are unemployed. All right. And so this is sort of the idea here. This is why economists are sometimes concerned when there are big increases in the minimum wage, because we are worried that it might create unemployment for this reason. All right. What are some other policies that might potentially create unemployment? So unemployment insurance. This could potentially reduce the incentive to search for work, and it might make the unemployed more selective about the jobs they accept. So to think about this, let's go to our model of individual incentives. So suppose Anne here, she expects to earn a wage of $12 an hour. She gets $7 an hour of unemployment benefits, and her cost of searching for work is this. And so her benefit equals the expected wage minus the unemployment benefit. So how many hours would she spend searching? So we can plot that out. So this is how much effort she has to put in. So the more hours she spends searching, the higher the cost, right? Just like any other time we look at marginal cost of increasing. So, and then the benefit, of course, is what she expects to get from each extra hour. And so it's 5. And so she would spend an hour searching here. Now, let's suppose her benefits are exhausted. So in the US, you get unemployment benefits up to a certain amount of time. And then after that, you're no longer eligible for those unemployment benefits. So if her benefits are exhausted, she no longer gets these unemployment benefits. And so now her expected benefit is just $12 an hour, right? Because you no longer have to subtract that out. And so the benefit of search rises from 12 minus 7 to 12 minus 0, which is 12. So she increases the amount of time she spends working. Basically, the idea here, the intuition is now that she is no longer So she's a lot worse off being unemployed now, and so this basically increases her incentive to find a new job. That's what the basic model of individual incentives would predict, and so she should spend more time searching for a job. And do we see this? In fact, it is true. So here, what we are plotting the sort of the probability a person exits unemployment as a function of how many weeks until their unemployment benefits are exhausted. So you can see up until, for most of the period when they have these unemployment benefits, their probability of finding a job is, right around 5%. Um, and then their 5% per week, I guess. And then their benefits get exhausted, and at that point, all of a sudden, their probability of finding a job suddenly spikes up. So in other words, these people were looking for work while they had unemployment benefits, but they might have been turning down certain offers, right? Then their benefits expire, and all of a sudden they are a lot more willing to take any job that they get. Now, this is not necessarily so this spike here, the fact that they are suddenly willing to take any job they find, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Because as we discussed, frictional unemployment is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we don't want someone to take whatever job they first find. We want them to look for the best possible match. Um, but uh, but it is worth noting, nevertheless, so regardless of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that these folks are unemployed, having more generous benefits does increase the amount of unemployment, but we have to think about whether it's necessarily a bad thing or not, right? I mean, it's also, while someone's unemployed and not able to find a job, it's probably nice that they're able to pay the bills. Um, so it's not, again, this should not be taken as meaning unemployment benefits are bad. It's just that one consequence of having more generous benefits is you will have a higher level of unemployment. Whether that level of unemployment is something we want or not is another question. Last policy issue I want to talk about is hiring and firing rigidities. So basically, so some governments have policies that literally make it difficult to fire workers. Um, so this is especially true in Europe. France is particularly notorious for this. Germany used to have this issue, and then they had a bunch of reforms that made it easier to fire workers. So why does this matter? This is another example of a policy put in place ostensibly to protect workers that may potentially actually make them worse off. So to understand that, suppose there are two types of people. So we have hard workers and slackers, and firms can't tell ahead of time who is a slacker, right? So under the doctrine of employment at will, which is what we have here in the US, a firm can basically fire employees who turn out to be bad. Basically, a firm can fire a worker at any time, um, and a worker on the flip side can quit at any time, right? So it's basically as long as an employment contract lasts, as long as both parties are okay with it, and as the moment either side decides they don't want it to continue, it ends. All right. So if they're under this doctrine of employment at will, what happens? So if you are an employer, you see this worker, you don't know whether they're good or not, you can hire them and try them out. And if it turns out they are a hard worker, you keep them and you can pay them. And let's suppose that you're paying them $10 an hour, your marginal product of labor is 20, and so your profit is $10. Um, and so you get this profit of 10. If it turns out they're a slacker, no big deal. You just fire them and then try again. You try to hire someone else, and maybe the next person you hire turns out to be a hard worker, right? So from this perspective, it works out fine. The hard workers have jobs, the slackers get fired. Let's suppose now that there is mandated job security. So as in some countries, it's very, very difficult to fire a worker regardless of whether you have a very good cause for firing them. So in this case, if the firm looks at someone, they don't know whether they're a hard worker or a slacker. If they're a hard worker, fine, you keep them, you get this good profit. But if they are a slacker, you are forced to keep them still. But because they are a slacker, you don't really get much benefit from them, and so you have zero profit. So what does this do? It means that an employer looking at a worker is going to think a lot harder about whether they want to hire them or not, right? So basically, it makes firms a lot more picky about the workers that they want to hire. So the analogy from the book, it suggested this one, which I think resonates with students. Imagine that you are um, uh, thinking about dating someone. And the rule is you do not get to date them for some extended period. Um, you go on a date, and at the end of that date, you have to get married. Now, if that were the case, how many people would you be willing to date? How many dates would you go on? Probably not very many, right? This is a huge level of commitment that you have to make without trying someone out at all. So nobody would go on dates, and there would be a lot of single people, or a lot more single people out there, right? And so the consequence of this, and this is especially true in countries like France, is that uh, firms are a lot less willing to hire new workers. So this is a very big problem for fresh college graduates because they don't have a record of having worked, and so nobody knows whether they are a hard worker or a slacker. And so firms will prefer people who have job experience, and that means people like you who are new to the labor market are especially hit hard, and the unemployment rate for fresh college graduates in France is extremely high, something like 1 in 3 fresh college graduates don't have jobs. It's crazy compared to what it is in the US. It's precisely because firms are punished so badly for making the wrong choice of who to hire. What are some ways that governments can actually deal with unemployment that might not have the adverse consequences of some of these other policies? So can you help workers without necessarily having unintended consequences? So one option people have looked at is job training. So in the case of something like structural unemployment, you have several areas of the economy, several types of skills that are no longer valuable. Um, you try to train them for new jobs. So the idea behind this would be somebody who was working in manufacturing. Now their job is automated. They no longer have that job. So they can't work in manufacturing anymore. So you take them and you try to teach them how to be a health worker, for example. You teach them to be a nurse. You teach them to take care of the elderly. And that's an area where there's very, very high demand for workers. Um, this is something that gets talked about a lot. Unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a lot of evidence about this being very successful. It's very hard to take someone who is 50, 60 years old and their job has been automated and take them and teach them an entirely new skill set, especially if they have kids and have to take care of kids or something like that. Another possibility is a subsidized job search. So maybe directly paying for someone to work. Um, this one, I haven't seen as many policies like this. Usually it takes the form of the government trying to actually step in and help people find jobs by maybe like setting up websites or setting up agencies that are meant to try to help people find jobs or actually paying for people to paying people's fees for hiring an employment agency for on their behalf. The last thing that you do is literally pay people to work. So in the US, we do this with the Earned Income Tax Credit. The idea behind this credit is if you work and you are relatively, but your job is not very high paying, so you work at a low wage, you will be forgiven some of your income tax, or in some cases it's refundable, meaning like even if you don't earn enough to pay taxes, you will still be paid by the government for each hour you work. And so the idea here is if you have someone who was previously working in manufacturing, maybe for $30 an hour, their job gets automated, and now the only job they can find pays $10 an hour at Starbucks, say, then maybe the government steps in and pays everybody who has lost a job because of automation. They cover the difference between their old job and whatever job they can find now to make sure that they are no worse off. And so in that case, this person who lost their manufacturing job might be a lot more willing to accept a job at Starbucks because the government is stepping in and paying whatever wages they've lost. All right, so structural unemployment is caused by shifts in the economy or by economic policies. So shifts in the structure of economy, it's very hard to reverse those. We have some active labor market policies, but ultimately that's quite difficult. the economic policies that might create issues like wage floors, so minimum wages, union wages, as usual in our model of supply and demand, this creates a gap between the supply of labor and the demand for labor. Unemployment insurance will reduce the incentive to search for work or the willingness to accept new job offers. So basically, it will increase frictional unemployment. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as I said, but it's worth noting it will actually increase the level of unemployment, whether it's a bad thing or not. Hiring and firing rigidities, they just make firms less willing to hire, right? So if you force firms to commit to keeping a worker, whether they are good or not, then they are less willing to hire anybody at all. And so one term to keep in mind here, employment as will is it grants employers the right to fire people for any job-related offense. One thing to keep in mind, employment at will does not mean you can fire people for things totally unrelated to the job. You can't fire someone because you don't like their ethnic group. That is not covered. That is illegal in the U.S. That is illegal in most developed countries, and it should be. This just means you can fire people for doing a bad job, basically. Last form of unemployment, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. This is called cyclical unemployment. So we will talk in a few lectures about the business cycle, recessions, booms and busts. And so when the economy is doing well, there are more jobs. When it's doing badly, there are fewer jobs. And so cyclical unemployment is just unemployment caused by recessions, caused by the busts. All right. And that's really all I'm going to say about that. All right. Before we wrap up here, I just want to give you some caveats. So I did this with the basic model of supply and demand. I really want to emphasize this in the case of the basic classical model of labor. There are a lot of limitations to this model. So for example, we have to ask ourselves whether the market is actually competitive, right? So we assumed here that every worker has, infinitely many potential employers they can work for. But if you happen to be working in some isolated area, or you happen to have set down roots in some place, you've bought a house, it might be very hard for you to search for a new job if you lose your job with your employer. And so in that case, it is not the case that you are necessarily facing a competitive labor market, a competitive market for your skills. That is especially an issue if you've been working for an employer for some time and you acquire some employer-specific knowledge. So you've been working for McDonald's for a year, 2 years, and now you really know how to make every item on the McDonald's menu. So if Burger King comes along and offers you a job, the problem is you don't know how to make the items on their menu. And so you are not as valuable to Burger King as you are to McDonald's. And so again, McDonald's is reaping more benefit from you than other employers, and so it's not fully competitive. You have some skills that cannot be taken and offered to another employer, right? And so that may be a consequence, or rather, so as a result of that, we might not necessarily want to take the implications of this model very seriously. And as a matter, or at least not totally literally. We might want to keep those caveats in mind when we think about policies related to the labor market. And the evidence on labor markets, in particular on minimum wages, is quite mixed, at least the evidence from the US. So economists have studied this quite a bit, and we don't have a lot of good evidence. So in general, the studies done on minimum wages are not up to the usual standards economists have for empirical research. That's not the fault of the people doing the work. It's just very hard to, we just don't have the tools we need in this particular context. But what we have seen suggests the evidence is quite mixed. Many studies do not find any evidence that small changes in minimum wage have any effect on unemployment. And that flies in the face of the model I just showed you. Large changes like the one we've done in California, we just don't have much evidence at all because it just hasn't happened before, right? A lot of these big changes of the minimum wage that we've had in California and that New York is also doing, they're just sort of unprecedented. So we just have to find out. We have to wait and see what happens. It's also not clear whether the short run effects of the change of the minimum wage, for example, would have the same effect as a long run effect. So it might not be possible for a firm to fire its workers immediately because of a change in the minimum wage. But in the long run, they may decide, okay, now we're going to just install some machines, find some machine learning algorithms that can do the work of our employees and then fire them later on, right? So you can't necessarily assume the short run effects equal the long run effects in this case. So um, keep those caveats in mind when you're thinking about how to use this model in the real world. All right, so quick review, talked about where supply and demand for labor come from, talked about the effects of minimum wages, at least within our simple model of the labor market. We talked about how unemployment shows up, how to define it, and we talked about some different forms of unemployment and what affects each of these. All right, so hope you were able to absorb this lecture given in this slightly unconventional form. So thanks for bearing with the difficulties that have arisen because of our current situation on campus.